implemented by southern providers is effective. And we have so many questions about the effectiveness of development programs implemented by South-South cooperation and southern providers. So it comes to the issue that should we find the ways to measure the effectiveness of South-South cooperation programs. And this is the objective of this workshop actually. We're trying to look for the way to move on in order to find the so-called indicators or the way to measure the effectiveness of South-South cooperation program. And our presenter, Anthea Mulakala, she is the Director of International Development Cooperation. She will take about 15 to 20 minutes to give some idea on monitoring and evaluation for South-South cooperation. After her presentation, for this session we will have about 50 minutes, right? So Anthea takes about 15 minutes, and then after that we go to the discussion, the Q&A session, and your suggestions as well. So, but after this session, we are going to have a group discussion again, and then let me welcome Anthea to make a presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Pakus. I'm not going to present the answers on monitoring and evaluation because the purpose of the session this afternoon is really for us as a group to brainstorm on, how do we tackle South-South cooperation? How do we monitor and evaluate it? And I think what was really evident in the discussion this morning is that in the aid coordination mechanisms that we've been talking about, South-South cooperation really didn't factor. So in countries in CLMV, even in Thailand, we have fairly good aid coordination mechanisms, but they're largely based around traditional DAC aid. So there's a big part of the story or the conversation that we know is going on is missing from the work that we're doing. So how do we try to capture that? So that's where we're trying to go in the discussion this afternoon. So although South-South cooperation between non-Western countries has existed for decades, it's really only in the last 5 to 7 years that it's become increasingly recognized by Western donors and understood within traditional aid frameworks as an important modality in development cooperation. And as such, South-South cooperation has come under considerable scrutiny by the OECD DAC, by multilateral organizations, by traditional donors, and as well within the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. So why is this? Why is it under the gaze? And there are many reasons, and I think Marasani outlined a lot of them for us this morning. As we saw, traditional aid is on the decline as an overall percentage of development finance. And as such, so is the influence of traditional donors in many countries. South-South cooperation in financial terms is increasing rapidly. And you have the emergence of new kinds of mechanisms like the BRICS Bank, for example, that are competing with traditional mechanisms like the World Bank or the ADB. And many recipient countries are actually indicating a preference for aid or cooperation or South-South cooperation from non-traditional partners, particularly where they have a choice amongst partners. And also there's a desire to bring all development actors and modalities and financial flows within a broad framework. And that's largely the premise that underpins the global partnership. So as I said, from this morning's discussion, it seems like we're missing part of the picture. We're not really capturing the data, nor the quality and impact of South-South cooperation. So has South-South cooperation been evaluated in the past? It's been going on for decades, as we know, 50, 60 years for many countries, Thailand included, I think. And surely there have been some means of measuring the value or benefit of the impacts of the efforts, whether by the providers or the partners. So as we work on or brainstorm indicators and different kinds of measures this afternoon, we should reflect on existing experience, knowledge, and practice from our own countries. So what we're proposing is that this afternoon we look at South-South cooperation at 3 levels. So one level is the global policy level. And this is what's more recently advocated by countries that are active in the post-Busan agenda. So these are not just Western countries, as we know, but they're also countries like Mexico, Timor-Leste, Korea, but definitely less so by countries like China and India. So I'll just jump to the 3rd level for a minute. So at the 3rd level is the project level. And this is where you can look at different types of South-South cooperation initiatives, whether they be training programs or they might be an infrastructure project, it might be a knowledge exchange, there's all kinds of things. And here, the assessment is not dissimilar to traditional monitoring and evaluation frameworks that we use for other types of programs, because it's a bit more tangible and concrete, the inputs and the outputs, and you can measure the impact, and often they're time-bound as well. But level 2, which I'm calling country bilateral partnership, I think is the trickiest and perhaps a new way of looking at South-South cooperation. And this involves more of a political economy analysis to understand the history and the motivations behind a partnership, and perhaps the less transparent aspects of a relationship between 2 countries. And here you'll really need to draw on your own experience. As we know, South-South cooperation isn't just about aid flows. It's a mutual benefit relationship that draws on many policy instruments and forms of cooperation. So how do we measure these different kinds of cooperation, especially when they intersect? Okay, so while it seems like most countries, and we've heard about that from this morning, have aid management systems, it's not clear whether this covers all forms of South-South cooperation. Though particularly those that are not necessarily aid-based. So it seems like the aid management systems and data collection systems we were discussing this morning cover grants and technical cooperation and probably some kinds of concessional lending, but they probably don't cover other forms of finance and cooperation. So what I've done here is just kind of listed some of the issues that we can consider under the 3 levels. So first, if you look at the global partnership level, and I think we've covered that this morning. I mean, that's generally what most of our colleagues presented this morning, was looking at the broad level of partnership. And the issues that we're addressing is, the aid architecture is changing, there's diversity in actors, forms, and flows. Mariceni pointed out most of these. There's increased fragmentation and management. So, you've got, Vietnam has 61 development partners, and there's all kinds of different financial flows. And when you account for China and India and the type of work they're doing, the modalities and the forms of finance are very hard to manage for some partner countries. Also, transparency and data availability. A lot of the flows coming from non-traditional partners are not measured using the same parameters that we count DAC-type aid. So, where do they fall in the budget? Are they outside the budget? They're probably outside the kind of counting mechanisms we use for DAC aid. Similarly, there's transparency issues from the provider countries. China doesn't publish publicly everything that it does with Cambodia, for example. Similarly, Cambodia doesn't publish everything it receives from China, perhaps. And then the whole question of aid coordination. We heard this morning China doesn't come to aid coordination meetings. I mean, I knew the answer to that before I asked the question, but I wanted to hear what other people will have to say. And that's similarly true. It's not just true for China. I mean, it's true for India, in some cases true for Thailand. They don't see those mechanisms as really serving the purposes of their bilateral relationship with their partner countries. So the indicators, these are the standard indicators that come under the global partnership. And Mariceni went over these this morning, and we talked about progress in the various countries. So at the country bilateral partnership level, this is the more tricky one, I think, and where there hasn't been enough exploration. So the issues here whoops, two computers going here, is, what is the nature of the partnership? So is it a strategic relationship? Is it political? Is there a historic relationship, an economic relationship? Maybe it's a little bit of all of those, but maybe one is more primary than the other, the reason why the two countries have a relationship. And so as a result of that, what is the objective of the assistance or the particular initiative? Is it about mutual benefit? And do the partners have different objectives, for example? So yes, last night we had a fascinating conversation about the Golden Triangle in the region over dinner, and I had no idea. There's this, the Chinese government long leases land in certain parts of Myanmar and builds entertainment facilities. And Thai people cross the border to gamble, and I'm sure people from other countries cross the border to gamble. And it's obviously an income generating revenue source for Myanmar, we would hope. Obviously there's a benefit to China, but maybe the benefits are different from both partners. Similarly, if India is building a bridge in Myanmar, or a road, and I think there are some discussions about that. What are the objectives from India's side? Clearly there's an infrastructural benefit for Myanmar. So the objectives of the cooperation may be different. And then the outcomes as a result may also be different. So, one country may increase its strategic leverage in another country. The recipient country may gain infrastructure or access. It's often been said, and Marianne, you may know more about this, that China's interest in the Pacific is because of UN votes, because there's so many countries there. So the amount of investment that China puts into the Pacific has a lot to do with geopolitical strategy. Whereas for the Pacific, they're getting investment. And then hierarchy of outcomes. So, the partnership may be based on, the political or the friendship between two countries may supersede the development impact, let's say. So indicators here are really tricky. How do you measure those kinds of relationships? How do you measure whether the political objective, the economic objective, or the strategic goals were met? And who determines what those are? Who benefited? So maybe there has been, a group of elites has benefited, but maybe that has, created some kind of security advantage, or military advantage, trade advantage for the country. At the same time, maybe there was environmental damage. We've seen that happen in some cases as well. What changed? What was advanced through the partnership between two countries? Stakeholder satisfaction. So here again, I look at who are the stakeholders that have negotiated the bilateral agreement between two countries. Often you can see there's two leaders come together and negotiate some kind of deal, right? So if there is satisfaction at that political level, does that mean it was a successful partnership? And then what about beneficiary satisfaction? So let's say you've negotiated a high-level infrastructure project that has increased political ties or economic ties at a high level between two countries. What about the people that are impacted by the infrastructure or use the infrastructure? Are we measuring that? And then what about the status of the partnership and follow-up? So sometimes, South-South cooperation relationships between two countries are not really contingent on success or failure. It's a long-term commitment and a long-term partnership with certain hierarchy objectives between two countries. So if a project fails, maybe it doesn't matter, according to that relationship. So you need to think about those things. Okay. So the third level, at the level of the initiative, again, I think this one is the easiest for us to get our head around. And here, it's about how do we identify, what the issue is we want to tackle. We define the intervention, we target the stakeholders and the participants, we implement the project, we do our follow-up. Again, there's always scope for improvement on these things, so how are we measuring the impact of community development projects or small-scale infrastructure or technical training? Has it really been done? Ban Feng was talking this morning about wanting to do some evaluation of TICA's capacity building, and I mentioned as well that In India now, they're starting to do some more rigorous evaluation of the ITEC program, which is India's sort of flagship technical training program that's been around for a number of years. So, how can we learn from each other on that? So how do we measure the success of capacity building programs beyond just input-output kind of driven way? How many graduates, how many people trained? Do we really see the impact of those? Was there knowledge transfer and exchange? Were the initiatives sustainable? If it was, in many cases, there's South-South cooperation around policy level changes and policy level reform. Was there any change as a result of an exchange between two high-level policymakers, let's say? Any change practice, and then again, importantly, were there benefits to the recipients? Okay, so my last slide is really some resources, because there are resources out there. We don't have to start from scratch here. So there is the guide to the monitoring framework of the global partnership. I think that was distributed or in our past, so we have that. We talked a little bit about that this morning. The World Bank Institute, I think, has a really user-friendly framework for monitoring, for designing and monitoring and evaluating knowledge exchanges, which are a big part of South-South cooperation. And it's called The Art of Knowledge Exchange 2. It's a toolkit, very helpful. Has all kinds of indicators. KSP is Korea's famous knowledge sharing program, and they also have kind of a modular focus and some guidance about how to monitor and evaluate these kinds of South-South cooperation initiatives. And then lastly, I'll point to RIS India, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of a think tank affiliated with the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and they lead kind of the development cooperation thinking in India. And as some of you may know, they're about to run a course on South-South cooperation, and so anyone who's interested really can go. And part of that will be, how do you design South-South cooperation initiatives, and also how do you monitor and evaluate them. So they are definitely, I think, leading from a Southern perspective some new thinking in this area. Okay, that's all I have to say in terms of presentation. Do you want to introduce what we do next, or?
Yeah, let listen from the floor first. Thank you very much, Anthea, for your ideas. And sorry that I missed some information in my introduction part. Actually, Anthea is the director of International Development Cooperation. Asia Foundation. I forgot to say Asia Foundation. Her base is in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Anthea has a strong contribution to our network NIDC so far, and we are expecting your contribution in the future as well. Especially from now on, we are going to move on to the trying to find the way to measure the South-South cooperation program, the effectiveness of South-South cooperation program. So your contribution would be very helpful, okay, for us. Then from Anthea presentation, Anthea proposes to look at the way to monitor and evaluate South-South cooperation at 3 levels. And she said that because at each level, program project level, country bilateral partnership level, and global level, each level has a different nature of coordination, a nature of cooperation, and each level has different elements. So we have to look at them separately and then see how South-South cooperation program is going on at different levels. So if we are going to monitor and evaluate South-South cooperation, we have to look at South-South cooperation program at different levels. And so from now on, we have about 20 to 30 minutes for a Q&A session, and then we are going to move on to the group discussion. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please. Yes, please.
Thanks very much, Anthony, for your presentation. Something that struck me as you were going through those 3 categories, Anthony, maybe that lies between the lines, maybe, and maybe particularly to the second, the country bilateral and the initiative project. And it relates sort of to the notion of power relationships. When we think of human relationships or contract or legal disputes, even if something that's styled sort of on an equitable basis, it's not unusual for there to be a balance of power or authority or leverage on one other party. I'm just wondering how it relates to that. In the case of South-South cooperation, that we've seen that the partners have very purposefully changed the nomenclature. They talk about partnerships and departing from the language of traditional DAC assistance. But it strikes me that somewhere in some of these things, there may be some underlying power relations that have to be accounted in terms of how people on each side of the equation might characterize the benefits that are flowing from it.
Is there any other questions? Comment was fine as well, not only questions.
Actually, in last 10 years, I've been working with JICA project, and also last year I was working with World Bank for looking at the effectiveness of the project monitoring process. So I think so far, also the point that we discussed this morning, like Mr. Kim said, it's a matter of power balance. And so far, when we talk about some sort of pushing for more effective utilization of aid for development, we are getting pressure from advanced nations and also multilateral organizations, as I said this morning. The issue for how to make South-South cooperation more effective, I think is a very important issue. And my thinking is, apart from power relation, what Kim just raised, I think one thing I agree with three levels. I think for global partnership, we can learn from what already exists. And the country bilateral cooperation, I think someone has to take initiative, particularly the provider. I think provider can learn from advanced nation. For example, I can explain to you the case of what Japan International Cooperation Agency is doing. They are trying to shift from what they have been doing. They have some sort of, course, the national cooperation level. They have some, the developing country has to, the recipient country has to be committed to the policy of JICA, for example. Then their policy is not so difficult to follow. For example, they have at each project level, they have some sort of monitoring process in terms of joint coordination committee meeting. So for my project, for example, we have a meeting every 6 months to evaluate what we have done and the plan for next year. And I think each project normally have some framework time frame. So, for example, if we have 5 year project, then we have to create the project design at the beginning, incorporated in M&E framework. So this year we started a new project, and this is our first time to incorporate M&E framework into project planning. So this type of thing maybe the southern providers can take up, and we have to follow every 6 months, and we have to be very clear with the indicators, framework and objective and indicators. So I think this may help, I think, for South-South cooperation effectiveness enhancement. So that's my initial thinking here. Thank you.
Sure. Any other comments, questions? Please. Sorry. You first. You first.
So, first, thank you very much for sharing. Well, since 1982, when I was studying in Europe, especially in the ISS, The Hague, then we study about the East-West conflict and North-South relationship. Now, the new word become the South-South cooperations. So starting from that, you know that the global situation was for East-West and North-South. Now, actually, South-South relationship. But the most important is, what I've studied, what my observation is that the most studied is, country bilateral partnerships, the main, the alignment to the development of the corporations. So, I don't know what is your idea for that, So the main thing is bilateral. Bilateral is even we are talking about East-North or the North-South or the South-South. But the main item is based on the bilateral. So what's on the comments?
Thank you very much, Anke, for your presentation. The 3 layers or tiers is certainly one angle of looking at it. So I really appreciate it because we've been doing South-South cooperation mapping, but very broadly. I suppose I just have 2 questions. As she was going through the presentation, then I asked myself, in the OECD DAC monitoring, it's very clear that it's for both benefits, the providers and the recipient countries, and both are reporting. In this context, perhaps it would be good to take a step back and say, well, you're developing an MNE system of framework for who? Is it the CLMD countries that need it? And you're happy to do it without buying from the providers of South-South cooperation? Who is it for? And I say this because in Mexico it's very clear that China, India, Brazil did not buy into the fund. But they have no interest in that global partnership. Whereas Mexico and South Africa and the United Emirates are interested. So there's a division in terms of the providers of South-South cooperation. So it'd be really interesting for you to knock that out. And then I really liked what you talked about in the country level. I suppose the other question I have there is then the accountability. Because as far as I see in China's white paper for development cooperation, they have sovereignty as a principle. And they leave the accountability of what they provide to the other party, to the receiving country. So then how do you measure accountability in such a context? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for questions, and I would like to ask Anthea to respond to those questions and comments.
Yeah, they're all kind of tied up together. I think the bilateral relationship is really the most interesting, and it is about a power relationship. And I think, and this came up in the first forum that we had here. I can't remember who raised the question. The fellow from Indonesia. It's really sensitive to when there's a power relationship. And it might be about China. It always seems to be about China, but it can also be about India and its partnership, let's say with Bhutan or Nepal, that's highly dependent. It's very sensitive to attempt to evaluate the impact, particularly from the partner side. Maybe if you haven't been very happy with some of the inputs, you might be afraid to articulate that because the relation of the partnership is so integral to your national development, in every way. So I think that's partly why a lot of it hasn't been monitored and evaluated over the years. And it's also why, China does have this demand-driven, many South-South cooperation providers have a demand-driven perspective, saying, if you ask for something, we will just give it. And you see a lot of the so-called prestige projects coming out that way. We'll build you a stadium, or we'll, give you whatever, because the benefits of, the friendship is that important, or the relationship is that important on different levels. But increasingly, and this kind of comes to the accountability issue, you're seeing some pressure coming from the domestic constituencies in China and India, even Thailand, I think, about how are we spending this money? I think there is an increasing accountability demand coming from the population. And so that's partly what drove China to produce 2 white papers, for example. Even though they really skim the surface of what's going on, there is a lot more people within China speaking out. And that's coming from the average person, but also from experts as well. So where you see them starting to look at accountability and M&E is that kind of national expert level academics. Who do influence government, who are starting to want to take a look at some of these things. Similarly in India. So I think there's a little opening there, and that's a way that we can start. You see, Dr. Mong asked about how do we start? And I think you start with this kind of forum, this kind of track 2 level. You bring people together who really understand the South-South cooperation between their countries and use them as a bridge, or you use forums like NIDC and other forums in countries to broker that relationship. So, because I don't think you're going to get a willingness directly from government to government to start questioning or looking at those partnerships, partly because of the power relationship and probably because it's just never been done in the past, right? And clearly they're not conforming to any pressure from multilaterals and others to do so. So JICA is in a different category. So JICA Japan is a DAC donor, and they conform to the international criteria and standards of aid effectiveness. So it's much easier to follow their criteria for monitoring and evaluation. It's completely different for China, India, and others that don't have those frameworks, don't ascribe to those frameworks. So we have to start somewhere else. Did I answer?
I think one more question you answer yet.
Which one?
I think the question raised by Leslie, which is I think very important and very significant, and it justifies our work here. Right, who benefits from M&E? M&E is for who, especially M&E for South-South cooperation.
Good question. So, I don't think there's one answer, right? I think for South-South cooperation, I think it's very hard to come up with a general framework because every relationship, every bilateral relationship is different and based on different criteria. So, in that sense, I think one of the partners has to initiate it. And then it has to be brokered carefully. So in some cases, like, if we use the example I just gave about accountability in China, there may be some interest from a particular constituency in China in looking at their assistance to Cambodia. That is a particular interest now. You have quite a growing interest in looking at that. So how do you broker that? Whereas it may be the opposite for a country that wants to renegotiate terms with its provider. So I don't know. I don't really have an answer for that, but I would say it's not a clear answer who it benefits. I mean, at the end of the day, the benefit is that you get better and more effective development cooperation in principle.
I think one very underlying principle is, you have to be mutually beneficial. So even South also, I think recipient country has to know what they will benefit, and the provider country has to know what the benefit, and those benefits have to be clear and agreed. You know, if there is hidden agenda, I think it's a problem. So I think there's a basic principle of cooperation.
And that's why there is more interest in it now. I mean, for decades, South-South cooperation was under the radar, really, from traditional frameworks. So it just went on for years and years without really any kind of rigorous evaluation. But now that it is much more under scrutiny, I think countries that are engaged in it feel more compelled themselves to have a look. So this is why you have India coming forward to take a lead in some of these global fora to propose, how are we going to do this? Let's take control of this, or let's lead this from a southern perspective.
May I follow this discussion a bit? If we have the ideas that southern providers and southern partners, developing partners, actually they are different. I mean, diversity is the principle for this, and then maybe, I'm not sure, then is it possible to standardize the process? I think this is the big question, because when we discuss about M&E, it means we are going to standardize, but the point for South is that we accept that we are diversifying, right? And this is our strong characters compared with OECD DAC. I mean, for example, when we talk about power relations, this is bilateral, and of course these bilateral will be different from another pairs. So then we come to the big question, whether it can be standardized. If not, if we cannot standardize, okay, fine. We start with bilateral and find out the best practice of each pair. And then what we can do is just only share the experiences instead of looking at M&E. I mean, and just throw the idea,
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's best to actually start with some examples where you have willing partners, and this might be a great forum to start, where you start with Thailand and one or two of its partners in amongst CLMV countries. Pick a program that's not controversial. Pick an initiative or a relationship that's not controversial, and start to bring parties together to actually assess it. Historically, what were the political benefits, economic benefits, and you will come up with something. And then start to share around that. And once you deal with things that are non-controversial, then maybe you can move on to look at other things. And that just opens a much more frank and equal discussion, which you should be having around South-South cooperation anyway.
Oh, please. Mekong from Thailand. First, I have to appreciate the NIDC. This morning I got the volume 1, issue 1, and this afternoon I got the volume 1, issue 2. So the NIDC very effective. So, and this I have to.
We are having volume 1, issue 3 in the printing house now.
Yeah, maybe this coming dinner you can release number 3. So I can say that the talking about M&E is like to join a party. Many people just enjoy and everybody excited when you join the party. A lot of food to eat, meet many people, north and south and south in the party. And then M&E is like at the end of the party. People just leave the party without pay, not intention. What kind of food, what still remaining, how to clean it, how to maintain the next party. And if you asking the guests, most of them just say that a good party. That most of the time they say that it's a good project. Believe me. And this is the Asian culture as well. We don't want to say, oh, this not so good project. Like, and this is not good.